All right, AP World. We're gonna obviously we're using video to finish off this unit. Could have done this in class just as easily, I suppose, but we've been covering a lot of notes in there, and well, um, doing some other things with our class time. So I'll run you through this. There's not a lot to cover. Finished up in class talking about China's experience, and very similar to what we talked about with the Ottoman Empire. Okay, so looking at two parts of the world that, to the large extent, the similarity between them is neither of them take that dive into industrialization. Both of them, kind of come out the other side knowing that they're falling behind now as a result of it, make efforts to try to reform, efforts that in both cases only are limited at best, just because of, neither of them establish reforms that actually, do take direct steps towards industrializing, and both of them, to a certain extent, kind of get caught in that push and pull between liberal reforming forces and conservative, more traditionalist forces, and so just kind of to keep those two in mind, and again, it gives you something to kind of compare against when we look at a lot of the dynamic change that was going on in those countries. Those European nations that industrialized, the United States that industrialized, and Japan that industrializes. Some examples there. Speaking of Japan, that's where we're going to head to next here, as we start to wind this down. Um, so Japan, matter of fact, as we covered even earlier in this unit with the Meiji Restoration, we see the government of Japan making some strong moves as we get to the end of the 19th century, turning to the 20th century, in terms of a government, an imperial government, that is running Japan, really basically, just kind of bolting down the power that they have over the country. This is exemplified in the late 19th century with pretty much that de-emphasis of the old Bushido code, that warrior code. The government cracks down on the power of the samurai, and this kind of gets the idea that instead of all this little localized, going back to the days of the shoguns and all that, is just kind of hammering home the point that no, we're just going to have one central government, and that's where power will flow. And so the defeat of the samurai, which involves some warfare within Japan itself. The samurai very reluctant to give up their positions in more localized power, but they end up being defeated, and so that out of the way. And with the imperial government now more or less completely in control, again, they continue with Japan's kind of crash course into industrialization. They begin to also basically copy some elements of Western education forms. And there's this move as well by their government to embrace some of the democratic values that come from some of the Western countries, the United States, and and again, that would be kind of the efforts of those who are acting a little bit more progressively, and Japan will experience the same, some of that push pull. Some who are worried that its traditional culture is still something that they want to maintain. I think I talked about that earlier in the notes. That there was kind of this desire to keep kind of one foot planted in tradition and then another foot planted in this modern world, and all the good that and power that these technologies are now bringing to them. And so Japan will definitely experience that push pull. I hope that you guys can read that, because on my screen I got this like interference on the screen. Hopefully you don't see it. Otherwise, strain, and I guess you can see through the kind of mess that I'm looking at on my screen. I don't know. Maybe it isn't on yours. Where I'll leave Japan, and yes, in a prime example of foreshadowing, is what we'll see happen fairly early on in the 20th century. and that's going to be a growing power within the military in Japan. Um, and the military will kind of be where most conservative thought um, tends to gather. And militarists, again, it's such a strange juxtaposition because where do they get their power? They get it with this industrialization, all this cutting edge weaponry. But it's going to be among the military leadership that there's the greatest fear that Japan loses its identity, and so we will eventually see the militarists basically kind of a hostile takeover and take the place and of the of the civil rulers of Japan, and that's kind of what ends up heading Japan down that eventual showdown with the West, World War II, and all that business. And stuff we'll return to a little later on. All right, where this wraps up is section 9, and just looking at how society has changed by the Industrial Revolution. And so, where we'll go with this is just to look at how it impacts the lives of populations in those countries that do, kind of take the full dive into industrialization, and how populations are impacted. When we talk about effects on urban areas, we can kind of take a look at first of all, just massive, rapid growth in the cities, and the fact that cities are not going to be prepared for this. As farming becomes less and less lucrative, and as things like the Enclosure Acts cut off a lot of farmers from land, they head to the cities to look for jobs. I mean, that's the only opportunity that's left for them. And so these cities are just going to see this, massive population growth that they're totally unprepared for. There's no, civic planning for this. They just have to react and just end up with, incredible overcrowding. Tenements are a name given to kind of like really cheaply built apartments, and kind of like the photograph you see up here above. A lot of times, like an apartment room that's going to have 3 or 4 families living in it. In part because they can find nowhere else, in part because they can't afford any more than that. And so we see in a lot of these cities the development of these slum areas of really hastily built, just kind of shabby housing that the poor, a lot of these industrial workers, in some cases, people still looking for work and struggling with that, and just creating that kind of an environment. The picture you see down there at the bottom, by the way, that's taken in the United States. I think that's taken, I believe, in part of New York City around the turn of the century. And yes, that's a dead horse lying in the road, because you're still in a world that everything is driven by animals, and most of your animals in the city used for hauling wagons, carts, human transport, all that were horses. It wasn't that typical. If a horse finally gave out, they just threw him to the side. I mean that's just the kind of level of ignorance, I guess you could say, there is about the spread of disease and germs and that sort of thing. And so safety risks, the violence, all of that as part of all this. I think it's early on in the 20th century that also in New York City, the Triangle Waste Fire. I think you'll learn about that in American history. A textile factory that is largely employs immigrant women, young women who most of whom had just recently immigrated to the United States, catches fire. And they're locked in the factory to make sure that they're being productive and all that, and I think it's hundreds of them die, just underscoring just how dangerous a life it was. We talked about some of those reform efforts, whether it was kind of through some of the kind of beginnings of the labor movement. But you're also going to have social reform movements going on. And as you make the transition into the 20th century, there will be a number of industrialized countries, including our own, that are starting to make those first baby steps towards, improving the conditions in cities, improving the safety in factories, that kind of a thing. All right. The effects on class structure. Most of your industrialized countries, by the time the Industrial Revolution has really taken full effect, whether we're talking, I mean, Marxism and all that aside, you have fairly distinct classes that have now formed, and there's definitely similarities when you look from one industrialized country to another, and so you are going to have that that lower class that is usually going to be distinguished by as the working class of people that are largely those factory workers, low pay, long hours, that sort of thing. You have this middle class that what I think we think of nowadays is kind of white collar. People who work jobs that maybe required some education, jobs that don't require them to quote unquote get their hands dirty, whether it's more like office work, accounting work, middle management, that kind of thing, making up this growing middle class, which we've talked about in this unit. And then, of course, the upper class, and usually, business owners, industry owners, those that are up there at the top. Also seeing this big change in, as I alluded to on the last slide, just this big change that is going on in that how the flow of societies had been going on for centuries in many of these countries, prior to industrialization, and now you are beginning to move from what had been largely agricultural economies, and where the vast majority of people identified as farmers. I think even still here in America, going into the Civil War, even 1861. North or South, most of the young guys who were signing up to join the fight in that war identified themselves as farmers. That's kind of how solid that, and that's the way it had always been. And you can look at those industrialized countries in Europe, the same way. Now, with the advent of factory work, the advent of the Industrial Revolution, we're seeing this big transition going on. And, one of the downsides is because of, child labor, because of the tough conditions, working these kind of jobs, we see for the first time where work, is beginning to have an impact on the traditional family unit. And we're seeing that fragmentation going on because, now children are being expected to work, because you have family members that are working in dangerous situations where sometimes, it fragments a family because of death, those kinds of things. And then obviously the effect on children kind of twofold. I mean, in a lot of cases, almost having to kind of raise themselves because of the long hours their parents are working, but more often than not, working themselves, and so not having that opportunity for an education, and pretty much dooming themselves to just kind of the cycle continuing that they work, and by the time they're in their 30s, they're already starting to basically physically break down. And as we talked about before, if you're a man living that life, you're not going to make it probably out of your 40s. And if you're a woman, you're probably not going to make it out of your 50s, living that kind of a lifestyle. And that's going to have nothing but a bad effect on children that are on this, caught in the middle of all this. Hold on just a sec. Sorry, my little dog always seems to know when I'm recording. It's like that's when he immediately needs to use the bathroom. All right. Anyhow, effects on women's lives. So you can look at this through a couple of different lenses here. The Industrial Revolution, its effect on women's lives. First of all, working class. Women who are working in those factories, and in most families, this is a necessity. It's not an option. And those women, because of nothing more than the fact that they are women, are paid less than men. Okay. There's no. We're talking about a time, in a place where there needs to be no explanation of that. It just is what it is. Well, and I could extend that kind of as an aside that children were paid even less. One of the other reasons why there was a full embrace of child labor by factory owners is that just improved their profit margin all the more so. For women who found themselves in the middle class, that's kind of where you're getting more into that that classic kind of housewife kind of an idea. Women who weren't working outside of the home. They were working, but they were working with child raising and there's the domestic duties that we a lot of times we don't get traditionally attached to women. And then to wind up on finish off on there, I think we earlier on in this unit when we were talking about the Enlightenment, we talked about kind of the roots and origins of feminism, as its own kind of political struggle. And historians do now, looking back, look at the Industrial Revolution as a period of time that really seemed to kind of light a fire under women who were attempting and beginning to kind of dial up the heat themselves on gaining more rights. I don't think it's any major coincidence. I think we were even talking about this in class as far as when women obtained the vote, and it was kind of coming right on the tail end of the Industrial Revolutions. We're going into the early 20th century. After the most of the the main action of the Industrial Revolution gone down, and so cause effect, you can probably kind of make a little bit of that argument. If you were faced with anything on the AP test, as far as the Industrial Revolution and its relationship, its connection to women seeking more equality and just kind of feminism as a phenomenon in itself. All right. And then where we'll finish things off will be the Industrial Revolution's effect on the environment, which I think, as you can assume, isn't going to be anything very positive going on here. Most of the fuels that are being used in these factories, even steam engines, that sort of thing, a very heavy reliance on coal and fossil fuels like that. And so the photograph you see there taken of I don't know if that's Birmingham, but it's one of those industrial cities of England back in the day. And you can kind of guess what the air quality must have been like. And so these urban areas where these factories are located, it's not like you get off after your 12-hour shift and flip open the walk out the doors of your factory and I'm out, and take a big fresh of that breath of fresh air, because no, that's what you're breathing is just this heavy pollution, and we know just from medical record and what little data was being tracked at the time that I mean, this put a lot of carcinogens in the air, and so cancers and diseases like that were killing a lot of people on top of just the work conditions themselves. And then water pollution also was definitely a factor that played a major role. A lot of disease that spread, diseases like typhoid fever and cholera that are mentioned there, were fairly common in these urban landscapes of the Industrial Revolution, and a lot of times being spread by polluted water. I think in AP Hug, you may have remember us learning about John Snow, who was a British doctor who, during the Industrial Revolution, was trying to pinpoint the cause of some of these health outbreaks, and was eventually able to trace it to one specific water pump that was supplying neighborhoods and workplaces around it with basically polluted water that was sickening people and causing them to die. It all kind of connects that way. All right, but I think does that get me all the way there? I think that gets me all the way there. Yes, there we go. All right, I did it in less than half an hour. Matter of fact, I did it in less than 20 minutes. You're impressed, aren't you? All right, guys, we'll call that good. And next week we wrap up and get ready to test over all this. All right. Thanks. See you in class.